Started?
Service part of the plumbers and cleaners and
All right, so I am Ralph Martire. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. I don't know, have any of the organization before? Yes, no? All right, so uniqueness, number one, we're not nonpartisan, we're bipartisan. So we have Democrats and Republicans on our board who don't actually like or trust each other at all. And that's great for us at the staff because it lets us focus on best practices and data. We have been, at our organization, fighting for going to a graduated rate structure in Illinois since we've been an organization, which is the year 2000. I think the League of Women Voters has us, though. I think they started working on this in the late 40s or early 50s, but we weren't around yet. If we were, we'd be with them. So this has been the historic problem, and this is really why we need a fair tax. And you can't understand the whys unless you understand what caused Illinois' fiscal problems or what got us to where we are today. But this is really the picture of why we have all our problems in Illinois from a fiscal standpoint. We've underfunded pensions. This mic is pumping in and out. We've underfunded pensions, why we have high property taxes, why the state has revenue. The whole thing is explained by this simple graph. It's called a picture of a structural deficit, and it really just measures a couple of things. Looking forward, if we had a balanced budget today, and we do not, but if we did, the yellow line shows you the projected cost of maintaining current services, not adding a program, not expanding a program, doing tomorrow what we do today, plus paying our debts. And the red line shows you what our anticipated revenue growth will be. And the difference between cost growth and revenue growth is called the structural deficit. Now, of course, this assumes you start with a balanced budget. We are not starting with a balanced budget. So the picture is actually worse than what this conveys. This just shows you how much the fiscal problem grows going forward. To know where we are today, you got to look at the state budget. So, overall, we're going to spend, you can see this top line here, or maybe you can't see, it's not very big, $40 billion. That's the 2020 general fund budget. Of that $40 billion, we've broken the expenditures down into their two main categories, hard costs and then discretionary spending on services. Hard costs are things the state has to pay either by law or by contract. So there's a statute or there's a contract that requires when the money comes in, the money goes out. There's just a couple of things, right? There's debt service to third parties like banks and bondholders. That's about $2 billion. The pension contribution is part of that ramp that was passed back in 1995. So that's a required amount by statute. There's a couple of smaller statutory transfers out a little bit, goes to Medicaid fund, road fund, et cetera, et cetera. That's about $400 million. And then $2 billion for group health on state workers. You add that together, $13 billion of the $40 billion is spent, nobody votes, the money comes in, the money comes out, they have the obligation. Then there's what they vote to spend the money on. And while they voted overall to spend $28 billion this year, they're really only going to spend $27 because of this magic line in the budget, something called unspent appropriations. They put this in every year. Illinois is not unique, other governments do it. It just means they're going to over-authorize spending, but they are going to not spend this dollar amount, and they're not just telling us what's going to be cut yet. So whatever your line is in the budget at the beginning of the budget year, that's a maximum possible expenditure on your service. It'll probably be less once they allocate the unspent appropriations. The key thing is 97% of what the state spends its money on, so over 90 cents out of every dollar, just goes to four services really. Education, and that's early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. Human services, healthcare, and public safety. So, you know, Illinois has had these fiscal problems since you were working for the state or local government, before you retired, before you became happy. Why should you be happy? I'm still working, but nonetheless, we've had these problems for a very long time. And you've heard politicians explain different approaches to solving them, none of which make any sense, but which get the politicians off the hook from doing something like voting on taxes. So they'll say, well, we need better priorities in Springfield. Really? What's better than education, healthcare, social services, and public safety? Exactly. Priorities are pretty good. Or they'll say things like, well, we need to eliminate all waste, fraud, and abuse before we could raise taxes. Well, that sounds rational, right? Who wants taxpayer money wasted, frauded, or abused? I will point out this is Illinois, so of course some of that will happen. It's just what you buy into. But less than 3% of the budget goes to stuff that's not education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. So in that 3% of the budget is the entire cost of central management services, it's environmental protection, it's economic development, it's the public parks that the state runs. I'm assuming we need to spend money on some of that, right? It's important. So waste, fraud, and abuse is kind of hidden in this other category. But if you were really to ferret it all out, which isn't possible in any endeavor that spends billions of dollars and is run by humans, many of them politicians, well, we can't eliminate all waste, fraud, and abuse. What you have to understand is it's a real small part of our budget. It's immaterial. It's not a driving factor. So while we should stay on them to not waste our money or be fraudulent with our money, holding elimination of waste, fraud, and abuse up as something to stop progress on tax policy is counterproductive. It's literally, it's not even letting the tail wag the dog. It's letting a flea on the tail of the dog wag the dog. It's tiny. So let's see where our fiscal condition really is in Illinois today. I told you we weren't starting with a balanced budget, but like that structural deficit assumed. How bad is it? Go to the top line over here. We have $40 billion in revenue projected for the year. Now that sounds good. If you remember, we're going to spend $40 billion, so that sounds balanced. Here's that $13 billion we have to spend by law, the hard cost. This is either required by a statute or contract. So take that out of your revenue right away. And that leaves $27 billion to spend on services. Go down to the second line. So we have $27 billion in revenue. But here's what they didn't tell you in the budget. They're not required to. The accumulated deficit left over from the prior fiscal year, $7.7 billion. I said accumulated deficit, you should hear that as unpaid bills. Whatever your unpaid bills are left over from one fiscal year have to be paid before the end of the next fiscal year. So that deficit becomes a charge on your current revenue. So take that out of the $27 billion, it leaves only 19.4. We have 19.4 billion in revenue. They are going to spend 27, meaning the deficit stays about where it was at about 7.5 billion. But to put that in context, that means 28% what we are spending on education, health, social services, and public safety is deficit spending. That's not sustainable. So we know we have a big deficit. We know we've had historic deficit problems in the state of Illinois. So then we should figure out whether or not rampant, out-of-control spending on services is part of the driver of the deficit. Because if it is, then part of your solution should be cut some of those expenditures, right? That's just rational. So let's see where we are. This is the state's own budget numbers on spending on services since the end of the Great Recession. No adjustment for inflation, just the actual expenditures, year by year. In 2009, at the end of the Great Recession, we were spending $27.5 billion on education, health, social services, and public safety, and other. Today we're going to spend less, 27.1. There is no crazy ramp up in spending on services. All the people that say spending on services is really a driver of the problem either are ignorant of the facts or they're trying to spin you. Because the data just don't support that argument, and in fact, never have. Taking a longer view, this goes on. This is the kind of chart we love at CTBA. You probably hate to show you all these numbers and say, "Oh my goodness, who would ever put together a slide like that?" This is like the kind of slide that makes us excited and happy. This compares spending on all those core services between the current budget and the year 2000 budget, 20 years ago, adjusting for inflation. So it's a real comparison. So the far left-hand column there is what we spent on core services in the year 2000. See, and I broke down education by its three main parts, you know, K-12, early childhood, etc., higher ed. The next line is what you'd have to spend this year to buy the same level of services that expenditure brought in the year 2000, just adjusting for inflation, to stay even in real inflation-adjusted terms. The third column is what we're actually spending, and the fourth column is whether we're spending more or less in real terms. So overall, we're going to spend 11% less on core services this year after inflation than we did in the year 2000. That's a big deal. We are going to spend a little bit more on K-12 education. There's the good news, 7.9% more. If I was making this presentation to you folks last year, that would still be a negative number. The only reason it's positive now, the only reason we're actually spending more is this has a new school funding formula that is requiring it. An additional 300 to 350 million schools every year. If we didn't have that, we'd still be negative on K-12 funding. This one, early childhood, has the biggest jump, 81% jump. There's the good news. Bad news is the actual demand for early childhood services in Illinois approaches $3 billion in cost. We're putting in $540 million. Okay, so it's good that we increased it. It's not anywhere coming close to meeting demand. And then everything else is cut. Higher ed has been destroyed. So when higher ed got, ignore this line for inflation here, the middle line. Higher ed got $2.1 billion from the state in the year 2000. This year, it's going to get less, 1.9. Not even adjusting for inflation in nominal dollars, the state's going to provide less to higher ed today than it did 20 years ago. So that's had impacts. You know, we started really cutting spending on higher ed under Rod Blagojevich. Because if you could do something wrong, Rod sort of sorted out and did it, right? That was his official policy. And so the year before he started cutting higher ed, 2003, our state appropriations for higher ed, this mic is not.
Yeah.
If I go without the mic and
Yeah,
talk like
that's
this,
better.
is that fine?
Yeah.
I used to coach Little League, so. Right? Make them run. That's the first thing you do at practice. Tire them out, then they listen better. All right, so Rod started cutting it in about 2003. At that point in time, the state of Illinois was funding 70% of the cost of a student attending a public university in our state. Tuition and fees that the kid had to pay were covering about 30% of that cost. Those numbers have now flipped. So tuition is over 70% of the cost, and state appropriations are less than 30. That's outrageous. And people say, well, why are kids leaving the state of Illinois to go to college and others? Well, that's why. Our growth in public institution tuition has outpaced the national growth over this period of time by over 50 percentage points. I mean, and it's all because the state of Illinois has disinvested in higher ed, and it's disinvested in higher ed because it's got a structural deficit. So that's what's going on. So I think what we've shown, the data clearly show, spending isn't the driving cause of our fiscal problems. It's always been bad tax policy. There are, however, some spending pressures coming the state's way. So I mentioned our new school funding formula, the evidence-based formula, right? Under this formula, the state has two new spending requirements for K-12. Number one, every year the state has to increase K-12 funding by anywhere between $3 and $350 million more than the prior year. Okay. That's number one requirement, new money. Number two, the bill is supposed to be fully funded on an inflation-adjusted basis, the evidence-based formula, by the year 2028, 10 years from when it was initially implemented. If, in fact, the state makes that maximum $350 million contribution every single year, it will take to the year 2047 to fully fund schools. A lot longer than 2028, right? And it's a real problem because we're going to lose generations of children to an underfunded school system. To actually meet the funding requirement under the bill, the state would have to increase funding every year to $843 million new money to K-12 over and above the prior year, more than double its current minimum. So we do have some spending pressures coming, but when you have a structural deficit where revenue doesn't even grow at the rate necessary to maintain the prior year's spending, you can see that's going to be a challenge to satisfy, right? All right. I told you that structural deficit picture explains a lot of our problems. So, when a state has a structural deficit, it's got a couple of options to solve it. One is raise taxes. Well, that's such a politically easy thing to do. I don't know why they didn't do it right. It's never any controversy over raising taxes. So that's hard, of course. Tax, by the way, is one of 2 3-letter words ending in X in the English language. It gets everyone all excited. The other one. So to avoid dealing with taxes, politicians at the state level tend to do 2 things. Number 1, push down to the local level the cost of funding a service that you have the responsibility to fund at the state level. What did you think they did in Illinois? They pushed down the cost of funding K-12, right? This is why your property taxes are high. So here are the numbers. The U.S., on average, covers, as you can see on the red bar, 44% of the cost of public education with local property taxes in a state. And 47% of that cost is paid for by state taxes. So 44 local property taxes, 47 the state, and then the feds cover anywhere from 8 to 10, and that's how you get up to 100%. Illinois, 67% of the cost of public education is paid for by property taxes. 67%. Less than 25% paid for by the state. Property taxes are high in Illinois because for generations the state hasn't had enough money to fund schools appropriately. So it's kicked that primary obligation down to local property taxes, and our property taxes in turn have grown at rates that once again outstrip the national average. So that's problematic, this little fiscal problem of a structural deficit. That's problematic in 2 different ways from a good policy standpoint. Number 1, funding education. You've tied the quality of education a child gets to the property wealth of the community they live in. So you live in a wealthy community, you get a world-class education in Illinois, you don't. Sound good? No, that's wrong. It's bad policy. But number 2, it's a lousy way to tax people relying on the property tax. And so here's the data that support that. We went all the way back to 1990 up to 2018, adjusted for inflation. Property taxes over that period of time in Illinois grew by almost 70% in real terms.
What year, Mom?
1990 forward. Median income grew by 11%. So that's about as unfair as you can be from a tax burden. Property tax doesn't care about your ability to pay it. In fact, here's what's interesting about all the discussion about the fair tax. The people talking about it know nothing, apparently, about tax policy. No tax at all cares about your ability to pay it except the income tax. Think about it. Sales tax. If you buy a tube of toothpaste and a billionaire buys that same tube of toothpaste, you each pay the same dollar amount in sales taxes. It's regressive. It doesn't care about your ability to pay it. You want the toothpaste, you're paying the same tax as a billionaire. Exact same tax. Property tax. Don't care about your ability to pay it. It's growing every year. You lose a job, you're on a fixed income, you're whatever. Property tax doesn't care. Income tax. Well, you lose your job, you're going to pay less. You get a raise, you're going to pay more. So just at a very basic level, the income tax somewhat responds to your ability to pay. But if you really want the income tax to respond to your ability to pay, you could have different rates at different levels of income. And we'll get to down the road why that's exactly what you should do. But all these people hitting the income tax, going to a graduated rate structure is a bad idea or bad tax policy, need to take a class on tax policy. It is literally the only tax that can be used to create some income fairness in a tax system. No other tax cares about ability to pay. Not a one. Every other tax is regressive. So, it's a lousy way to tax people, this reliance on the property tax. And we're there because the state doesn't have adequate revenue every year to continue doing what it did the year before. And now, the state has new demands on its revenue to fully fund education in accordance with its new school funding formula, which we all want it to do from state taxes, because you know what that'll do to property taxes? It'll push them down. Because the state will finally be stepping up to the plate in funding schools adequately. You know how short it is of funding schools adequately right now, dollar amount? $7 billion with a B. So yeah, and that's in fact almost the exact same amount as our deficit. So there you go. We have some problems. Now, what has grown in Illinois? And so these are the hard costs for different things like debt service to the bank. That's grown very little over time. In fact, it's less than it used to be. And statutory transfers out, we've moved a lot of them out of the general fund. That's the yellow bar. That hasn't grown much. Look at this light blue bar. Those are the pension payments under the ramp. Well, those have grown. But those really aren't pension payments at this point in time. They are debt service payments. So in the year 2020, about $8.3 billion is going to the pension systems from the general fund, and roughly $3 billion of that is actually paying the cost of the pensions. $5 billion and change is paying back what was underfunded in the past, which gets me to what happens when you have a structural deficit for a long period of time. Not only does state government push the responsibility to pay for other things down to the local level, they try to find ways to hide the structural deficit by, I don't know, borrowing against some long-term obligation due in the future to fund current services now. What long-term obligation do you think they hit on? Pensions. So for years, they just wrote an IOU to the pension system instead of putting in what they should have. If our total pension payment this year out of our general fund was only going to be the $3 billion it actually costs to fund the pensions, no one would be talking about a pension crisis. As a percentage of our general fund, it's actually below the national average. Here is the pension ramp going forward. From our current fiscal year in the far left to its payoff. You add these two bars together, that's how much the payment grows year to year under that 1995 pension ramp. Now, I'm really good at tax policy. I do teach a master's course on it at Roosevelt. I can't design a tax to grow like that. Well, the fiscal term is it's goofy. I mean, it can't be done. It's unaffordable. It's ridiculous. It was never meant to be funded. Now, I broke the payment down into two parts. You see the pink and the blue. You add them together, that's the total payment. The pink part, that's actually the normal cost of funding the benefit. The blue part is the plan for repaying what was borrowed. What do you think is driving the state's problems? The cost of funding benefits or paying back what was borrowed due to this goofy plan passed in 1995?
That's right, that pension.
Really? You're better than any legislator. Because I make this presentation all the time, and they're like, oh, and what comes out of Springfield? Let's cut benefits. Really?
Yeah.
You cut benefits, that's this pink one. You think that's going to save any money? No, it's ridiculous. So the bottom line is, we have this unfunded pension liability because for generations the state had bad tax policy, so its revenue didn't grow with its costs. We didn't have the political will to deal with tax policy, so politicians chose, both parties, to borrow against what was owed the pensions to hide that structural deficit. use the money to fund current services, and then write an IOU to the pension. And now we're paying those IOUs back, and everyone's saying cut benefits. It's not about cutting benefits. It's about making a rational payment plan for this, because obviously we can't afford this and no tax policy is going to do it. And fixing our tax policy to work in the modern economy. That's how you solve this problem. So let's skip this slide, because I don't want to. All right. So this is the solve to the pension problem. The red line is that prior slide I showed you. It's the pension rate. That's how much payments grow over time. We would replace those payments with these blue bars. That's called refinancing, re-amortizing the debt. What are the differences? Couple. We put more in up front than what the ramp currently requires, and then we level out the payments. This promises to get the systems, which currently are only 39% funded. I don't know if you know what that means. That means they have 39% of what they should have. You are considered to be healthy if you are 80%.
61% is the debt.
That's 80% of what you should have. We have 39%. That's decidedly unhealthy. Okay. So this promises to get us 90% funded by the year 2045. The refinance gets them 72% funded. But here's the difference. It costs taxpayers $45 billion less in taxes. You save $45 billion in debt service, which means you don't either have to raise it in taxes or cut spending on education, health, social services, and public safety, and still get the systems to 72% funded. If I had 30 years, I don't have 30 years, I could easily get them 80% funded. We're living within the pension ramp period that was passed back in 1995, so I have less than 30 years. It's crazy. It's crazy to throw that money away on debt service. It's crazy to raise taxes to that level, and it's crazy to cut spending on everything that we're underfunding, right? I mean, so the bottom line is, let's refinance it. Now, if you want to get angry, and I hope you do, but if you want to get angry, if they'd have done this 2 years ago, we could have saved taxpayers $67 billion. But you know the magic of compounding interest, right? Every year you wait, solution gets more expensive. First time CTBA proposed this was around 2004 to 2006. See, the total payment to taxpayers now is just under $12 billion a year. Back then, it was $4 billion a year. It has tripled. That's the cost of waiting. So we really got to put some pressure, please put some pressure on your elected officials to, in addition to the fair tax, deal with refinancing this pension debt. It's crucial. The fair tax alone, support is a great idea. They should do. It's good tax policy. Doesn't come anywhere near solving all our problems. It's a major step forward. We have to do it. But if we really want to get out of this crisis, we also have to do this and maybe a few other things. But the two big ones are the fair tax and this. All right, so there's my horrified taxpayer. So yes, when you have a big structural deficit, you are going to have to look at raising taxes, especially when you know that cutting spending on services isn't a rational approach because you are already underfunding everything. And in fact, you've been cutting spending in real terms for 2 decades, right? So more cuts just aren't really a good way to solve our problems in Illinois. We need to do better with higher ed. We need to do better with K-12. We need to do better with early childhood. We need to do better with healthcare. Social services have been eviscerated. I mean, we need to do better. So when you have to raise taxes, you got to deal with one of the real thorny issues in tax policy. And this is why it's so hard to get taxes right. Wherever your needs are greatest in your state, your resources are least. That's just the truth. So that means tax policy to work has to be redistributed. You have to raise from people in areas of wealth and invest in areas of need. If you don't do that, you can't cover the cost of services. That's not ideological. That is arithmetic. So, how do you create fairness, as in get money from wealthier people to invest in areas of need? And the answer is we can't do it really through the sales tax. That hits everyone the same. Can't do it really through the property tax. That's a local tax. It's not state revenue at all. Can't do it through the excise taxes. That's the things like cigarette taxes or liquor taxes or gasoline taxes. dollar amount per unit, like per gallon of gas, per pack of cigarettes or whatever. Same tax for everybody, that's regressive. You've got to look at the income tax. So if you're going to look at the income tax and you're going to try to design it the right way, you want to make sure that it works in a capitalist economy, and I'm sure you're all a bunch of meat-eating capitalists. I know I am. I do have a copy of The Wealth of Nations on my desk, and The Wealth of Nations is what? Written by whom?
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith, who invented capitalism. Now here's my bonus question for the class. What year was The Wealth of Nations published?
1776.
That's right, America and capitalism, born together, meant to be. Come on. So, if you're gonna try to tax wealthier people in a capitalist economy, let's look at capitalist principles of taxes to see if there's some guidance, and there is. I'm gonna read this quote straight out of The Wealth of Nations, but it's that important. I don't like to read from my PowerPoints. It's important. The subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities, that is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Homelord Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. That is not Karl Marx. That is Adam flipping Smith. It's Adam Smith. Now, why did Adam say this? Bargaining power. If you read The Whole Wealth of Nations, he said because of disproportionate bargaining power between the owners of capital, really wealthy people, and laborers, the owners of capital will always get disproportionate share of growth in income over time, because they will take some of the value laborers create away from laborers and put it in their own pocket as part of the bargaining process. That is how it will work. That is what bargaining power does. So since that's how the system's going to work, and these people at the top are going to get this disproportionate share of income growth over time, they should have the greatest taxes as a percentage of their income to pay for the government that in turn supports an economy that gives them a disproportionate benefit. It was very logical. Was it rational? We could test it with data. Next slide. So this is income inequality in America over a long period of time. And this is just based on what Americans reported to the IRS as their income on their income tax returns. So, from the end of World War II, 1947 through 1979, after inflation, the wealthiest 10% in America got 34% of all the growth in income. And the bottom 90% got 66%. Now that's a disproportionate share to the top, much like Adam would have predicted, but it was a good time in America. A rising tide was lifting all boats. It didn't matter how you cut the income data. Every cohort of earners was seeing real growth in income over time, so real improvement in purchasing power, real improvement in standard of living. Yeah, things have changed. Oh, no, that's one. Things have changed. So from 1979 to 2015, last year we have data for, the wealthiest 10% got 108% of all the growth in income after inflation. 108. So if you dislike math, I will point out 100% is all of it. So if more than all the growth in income went to the wealthiest 10%, that means literally 90% of the country was earning less on an inflation-adjusted basis at the end of the sequence they did in 1979. Adam would not have predicted this. He would have predicted the first one, not the second one. There's a lot of reasons we're not going to get into the Wealth of Nations rationales. But what's clear is you need a tax that can respond to how income growth is being distributed in the economy. The only tax, as I've said before, that actually could be designed to respond to this is an income tax. And then only if you have higher tax rates at higher levels of income and lower tax rates at lower levels of income. That responds directly to how incomes are being distributed in the economy over time. Now let's talk about Illinois data. So this is Illinois. That top red line is from 1979 to 2015, so we tried to copy the same data set. The growth in income for the wealthiest 1% in our state. After inflation, their incomes grew by over 170%. More than double. The bottom 99% saw a total income growth of about 9%. So if you wanted to respond to that, obviously you'd be focusing up here. Next slide. And you know, if for a long period of time, what you have is this disparity in income growth with the people at the top getting far more than the people at the bottom and middle, you're going to have disparity in wealth, right? This is just census data, so you could go run these numbers yourself if you so choose. The wealthiest 10% in America have 77% of America's wealth. The wealthiest 3% have over half of all of America's wealth. So you kind of want to focus your taxes up here, not down there. And once again, the only tax that could do that is a fair tax if it's a graduated rate structure. I think I have one more Illinois tax policy slide here. So basically, our tax policy ignores Adam Smith's admonition that taxes ought to be designed to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. We focus our taxes on low and middle income families, and we tax our upper income families far less. We have a regressive system rather than a progressive system. So all the data and our private sector economy and good sound tax policy in a capitalist economy consistently make the case that we need to go to a fair tax. We need to amend our Constitution to allow a graduated rate structure. Currently, our Constitution, as you know, requires one flat rate, all levels of income. And that's impossible to counter regressivity. I just thought I'd show you this because I gave you that prior slide that showed, you know, the bottom 99% in Illinois saw 9% growth. All that growth was still in the top 10%. The bottom 90% in Illinois are earning less today than they did in 1979. So really, you want to focus your taxes at the top, not the bottom in the middle, to the extent you can, and that requires a graduated rate tax. So this is outrageous. It's real data intensive, so I'm only going to focus just on those two bars in the very far left. The blue bar shows the ratio of income of the richest 1% in Illinois to the bottom 20% before taxes. So before taxes, the wealthiest 1% in Illinois have incomes that are 137 times greater than the bottom 20%. After taxes, they have an income that's 149 times greater. Our regressive tax system worsens income inequality because it so focuses on low and middle income families and so undertaxes wealthy families. Someone's going to have to justify that. Because I think that that's outrageous, and it's consistent across income levels, that's what it means. So, what is the proposal? So there's two. Proposal number one is simply the amendment to the Constitution, and that's just a permissive amendment. If that is ratified by the voters this November, then our Constitution will be amended to allow a graduated rate structure. None of the rates, none of that stuff would be in the Constitution. I'd actually testify against doing that. That's bad policy. We would just have a Constitution that would permit a graduated rate structure. This is the accompanying legislation that was passed by the General Assembly, signed by Governor Pritzker, so that if voters ratify the fair tax, then on January 1 of 2021, this will be our new tax code. And if you look at it, our current flat tax is 4.95%. That's our current rate that everybody pays on all levels of income. What they do is they lower that rate on your first $10,000 of income, and then lower it again on your next $90,000 of income. So, and with one exception, everyone pays those lower rates on their lower levels of income. So if you earned, say, $200,000, so you'd be at the 4.95% rate, you'd still only pay 4.75% tax rate on your first 10,000 of income. And then you'd still pay only 4.9% tax rate on your next 9. You'd still pay a little. That's how a marginal rate structure is. There is one exception. The exception are really rich folks. If you are, this is single on the far left-hand kind, so if you're filing your tax return single, head of household, or if you're married filing jointly, that's the second column. So if you're single and you have taxable income, this is all taxable income, so that means after all your deductions and credits, so right, not your gross income, your taxable income. If your taxable income is $750,000 or more and you're single, you don't get any graduated rate structure. You go from having a 4.95% flat rate to a 7.99% flat rate. And if you're married filing jointly and you have taxable income over $1 million, same thing. Okay? How does this impact taxpayers? Does it work? Does it provide some tax relief? Does it raise money? That's the next slide. So, it absolutely does, and we have vetted the governor's numbers independently. We got all the data sets from the Illinois Department of Revenue. It absolutely does what the governor says it does. Number one, it raises taxes, but only on the wealthiest 3% in our state. That means 97% of the people who file tax returns in Illinois will pay less than they do now. Pay less. It's a tax cut for 97% of the state. It is not a big tax cut for the 97% of the state. You are not going to buy that summer home in Canes you've always wanted with your tax cut. You may be able to buy an extra package of ho-hos, which I personally like. Got my money targeted for, but you can have your own.
I'm a Suzy Q man.
You're a Suzy Q. I respect that. Respect Suzy Q's. Devil's fruitcake. Nothing bad. But the bottom line is it's a very small tax cut for everyone else. But it is a tax cut. So there's no spin by the governor's office on this. It raises $3.6 billion in new revenue. We need that revenue, and that revenue will grow over time. And it does it at tax rate that is very reasonable. So our new top tax rate is 7.99%. And remember, that only kicks in if you've got taxable income of either $750,000 or $1 million a year more, depending on whether you're single or married. Look at our neighboring states or Midwestern states. Minnesota's top tax rate is 9.85%. Kicks in at $163,000. Iowa, red Iowa, has a tax top rate of 8.5% that kicks in at $71,000. Maroon-ish Wisconsin, they do some goofy things periodically. Maroon-ish Wisconsin, top rate about the same as ours, but kicks in at a lower level. So the bottom line is, all these attacks being made against the fair tax simply aren't data-based. Our rate is rational, it's within national norms, it's within Midwestern norms. It raises needed revenue. It absolutely reduces tax burden for low and middle income families, and it goes a long way towards helping solve our fiscal problems. It is not a silver bullet. We need to do other things, but it's a really, really, really important step forward. Okay. And this is just to show you it works. So the red line is tax burden as a percentage of income under current law from the bottom 20% on up to the wealthiest 1%. The blue bar is how tax burden changes under the proposal. And you can see everyone pays a little bit less until you get to the wealthiest 3%, and then they pay more. Notably, however, they have so much income that even though we're raising $3.6 billion from them, they still end up with the lowest tax burdens in the state as a percentage of income. This is not some crazy eat the rich strategy, right? But it does work, and the math checks. We check their math. So, yeah, I'm not going to even get into that. This is some of the other tax policy stuff we need to do. Let's go on. And will tax increases kill the economy? Let me think about it. No. So, there has never been a peer-reviewed study that shows any statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and your economic growth. Other things matter more. I have a number of slides to that effect in here. We could skip that one, we'll go to this one. How about Kansas and Minnesota? Kansas, under Governor Brownback about 10 years ago, right? He was Mr. Supply Side. We're going to cut taxes on the job creators. You should hear that as really wealthy people. So we're going to cut taxes on rich people, and that'll free up so much of their income too. Wait for it. Trickle down on everybody. Do you really want to be trickled on by rich people? I'm just asking the question. It's a bad image in my mind. To trickle down on everyone else, creating so much new economic activity and jobs that even though we're cutting taxes on the wealthy, we won't have deficits because all these other people that wouldn't have had great jobs now get jobs because of the trickle-down effect, and they're going to pay taxes. So the tax cut pays for itself, and our economy will be stimulated. We'll grow faster than the Midwest and Kansas or the rest of the country. So they did. They cut those taxes, and what happened? Their economy did not grow faster, it grew slower. They had huge deficits. They had to cut spending on education so severely that the Kansas Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutionally denied children access to a quality education under the Kansas state constitution and forced the General Assembly to restore the cuts, and they ultimately got rid of the tax cuts and raised taxes. Then you had Governor Dayton come into office in Minnesota, and he inherited a hot mess, right? He had a $6.1 billion accumulated deficit in a state that has a population about the size of Cook County. So that's not good, that's bad. He had bridges and stuff collapsing everywhere. He couldn't fund schools. He had a state economy that only created 4,000 jobs in the prior 7 years combined. High unemployment rates. He said, you know what? Our state can't pay its bills, we can't fund schools, we can't have capital programs without a tax increase. So he raised taxes on the wealthiest people in Minnesota, and in fact his new top tax rate of 9.85% for his income tax is the third highest tax rate of any state in America. It's right up there with the Californias of the world. I mean, it's up there. What happened? 4 years later, deficits were gone. They had a surplus. They had two capital programs. It created over 120,000 new jobs, and their unemployment rate dropped down to below the national average. So you can see raising taxes on the wealthy just destroys your economy, right? You know, it's amazing that there have never been any data that support those contentions. Yet we buy it as voters, meaning the public at large, because we want to, right? We want to believe that less taxes somehow does good stuff for the economy, because that means we don't have to pay more taxes. And nobody finds paying taxes an enjoyable experience. I don't find paying taxes an enjoyable experience. But I liken it to my mortgage payment. That's not enjoyable either, but I do like sleeping indoors. And hence, my mortgage payment, as unenjoyable as it is something I'm willing to make. We don't like paying taxes. If you like paying taxes, I guess you're a great American. You're odd, but you're a great American. But you probably like what it funds. You want every kid to go to a quality school. You want vulnerable populations cared for. You want everyone to have access to health care. You want people to come home to streets that aren't overrun with gangs and violence. You want what public services provide, and that costs money. So we really need a new conversation around all this, right? That takes some of the nastiness out of it. But the bottom line is, if you raise your taxes on wealthy people, it's not going to destroy your economy. And I want to be clear what I'm saying. I am not saying you can tax your way to prosperity. That's a silly thing to say too. What I'm saying is you need to design your taxes to work in a modern economy. And you need your income tax to respond to the fact that income growth has so disproportionately going to the top. You need rate structure to reflect that, or you won't raise adequate revenue to fund core services, and that will hurt your economy, okay? So the bottom line is just design your tax policy to work in a modern economy, treat taxpayers fairly, and these other problems will take care of themselves. A couple more things on, differences. So only 41 states in America have an income tax. 9 do not. And of those 9 states with no income tax, a lot of the anti-tax groups call them the miracle economy states. You have Florida and Texas and North Dakota, Nevada. And Nevada has gaming, and Texas has oil, and North Dakota has natural resources, and Florida has a very famous mouse and nice weather. They don't talk about those things. They say it's because they have no income taxes. So what this graphic does is it compares economic growth and the core factors between those, over the last decade, by the way, between those 9 states in America with no income tax at all, your miracle states, and the 9 states in America that not only have income taxes, but have the highest rates. So California, Minnesota, New York, Connecticut, etc. The blue bars are the high tax states. The red bars are the no tax states. In every major economic indicator, the high tax states are outperforming the no tax states. There are no data that support the argument raising taxes on wealthy people destroys your economy. Other things matter. So that's why we're at a point where we really should have everyone out there supporting the fair tax. It's the right thing to do for Illinois. It's the right thing to do for Illinois taxpayers. It's the right thing to do for our fiscal system. It will help get our house in order. It'll help us do crazy things like fund schools adequately and finally resolve these long-term fiscal problems that really resulted in underfunded pensions, high property taxes, and so many other issues. All right, convinced? Great. I'll go. Thank you.